Hey guys, so today we're going to take a look at perfect squares. So first of all, I want to show you some of the problems that you're going to have to answer after this lesson. You'll be told to evaluate problems like this: 4 squared or 8 squared. Or you may be given problems like this: what is the square root of 64? Or evaluate the square root of 100. So our goal is for you to understand how to answer questions that look like that. So now let's take a look at, and then we'll come back to the answers at the end of the lesson. What is a perfect square? Well, what do you know about squares? They're a 4-sided shape. All 4 sides are exactly the same. So we say something is a perfect square if it has all those 4 sides the same. Well, if those sides are, let's do a 1 by 1 or a square with a side length of 1. To find the area or the space inside, that's what area is, we would do 1 times 1 is 1. That is a perfect square, 1 is. Let me show you another one. What if, let me make it look like a square. What if I gave you this square and I said the side lengths are 2 and I ask you what is the area? Well, remember we do length times width. 2 times 2 is 4. The number 4 is what we call a perfect square. So when you multiply any 2 numbers together, the same number, your answer is what's called a perfect square. So let's take a look at some of the most popular or most familiar perfect squares. 1 times 1 equals 1. So 1 is a perfect square. 2 times 2, envision a square, the shape a square. That's a 2 by 2, or one side length is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. What about 3 times 3? 3 times 3 is 9. So a perfect square with a side length of 3 would have an area of 9. Let's keep going with our perfect squares. We've already talked about this one. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. 6 times 6 is 36. See how you're multiplying the same number by itself? Your answer is a perfect square. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81. Let's keep going. 10 times 10 is 100. So 100 is a perfect square. 11 times 11 is 121. And I'm going to go up through 12. 12 times 12 is 144. So all of these are perfect squares. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, and 144. Those are all perfect squares. And you can also think about this because 1 times 1 is 1 squared. 2 times 2, that's how we read this exponent. That's 2 squared. 3 squared is 3 times 3, or 9. 4 squared is 4 times 4, or 16. 5 squared, 5 times 5 is 25. I'm going to keep going here. 6 squared, 6 times 6 is 36. 7 squared, 7 times 7 is 49. 8 squared, which is 8 times 8, is 64. 64 is the perfect square. 9 squared, 9 times 9 is 81. 10 squared, or 10 times 10 is 100. 100 is that perfect square. 11 squared, is 121. And 12 squared is 12 times 12, or 144. So if I were to give you something like this, let's do one that we've not listed yet. Let's say I give you 13 squared. and I want you to evaluate that, that means I want you to do 13 times 13, which is 169. That's how we do squares. Now, there's something that's the opposite of square. And let's jot this down in our notes. That's called, let's see, maybe I should have written this up here. 13 squared is 13 times 13, or 169. So now let's do the opposite, which is this. That's called a square root. So here's how you do the square root. It's like you're working backwards from a square or a perfect square. So the square root of 1 is 1, because 1 times 1 gives us 1. The square root of 4 is 2, because 2 times 2 gave us 4. The square root of 9, see how I'm using my perfect squares to do that? The square root of 9 is 3, because 3 times 3 will give us that 9. See, square and square root are opposites of each other. So let's keep going. Let's keep finding the square roots of these perfect squares. So the square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 gives us 16. Let's find the square root of 25. That's 5, because 5 times 5 gives us that 25. What's the square root of 36? Well, what times itself gives us 36? 6. What's the square root of 49? 7. Again, I'm finding the square roots of perfect squares. What's the square root of 64? 8, because 8 times 8 is 64. The square root of 81 is 9. The square root of 100 is 10. The square root of 121 is 11. That's because 11 times 11 goes back to that 121. And the square root of 144 is 12. So one more time, these numbers right here, let's see if I can, I'll just highlight them. These numbers that I'm highlighting right here, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, those are perfect squares. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, and so forth. These over here, you gotta make sure you get your terminology right. These are square roots of perfect squares. That radical that looks like a check mark is called a radical symbol or a square root symbol. So these are square roots of perfect squares, and the ones in yellow are perfect squares. Now let's go back and answer the questions that we started the video with. So if I ask you to evaluate 4 squared, that simply means, what is 4 times 4? It's 16. So 4 squared is 16. 8 squared, which means 8 times 8, is 64. And then the square root of 64 is 8. What is the square root of 100? Well, 100 is a perfect square. So we get 100 by doing 10 times 10. So the square root of 100 is 10.